In 1975, Sylvester Stallone had just $106 left to his name. He was homeless, sleeping inside a bus terminal in New York, rejected more than 1,000 times because of his face and his voice. The same man would soon create Rocky, a film that won 3 Oscars and changed cinema forever. But what most people don't know is that his greatest battle didn't happen in the ring. It happened when he had absolutely nothing left. On one freezing night in New York, Sylvester Stallone wasn't thinking about movies. He wasn't dreaming about fame. He was just trying to survive until morning. With no money for rent, he slept inside the Port Authority bus terminal, surrounded by strangers, neon lights, and the constant echo of footsteps that never stopped. In his pocket, he had almost nothing. No job. No agent. No future anyone believed in. Hunger followed him everywhere. Days passed when he barely ate. And then came the moment that broke him. Stallone stood outside a liquor store, holding the leash of his dog, Butkus, the only companion who had stayed with him through rejection after rejection. But he had no money left. No way to feed himself. No way to feed the dog. So he did the unthinkable. He sold Butkus for $40. As the dog was pulled away, Stallone stood there, unable to move. Later, he would admit that this moment hurt more than every rejection Hollywood ever gave him. That same night, sitting alone, something shifted. Not hope. Not confidence. Just desperation. He realized he had reached a point where there was nothing left to protect. Nothing left to lose. And when a man has nothing left, that's often when the real fight begins. Sylvester Stallone didn't grow up believing he was special. From the very beginning, life had already marked him as different. He was born in 1946, in New York City. But during birth, a medical complication damaged a nerve on the left side of his face. Part of his mouth became paralyzed. His speech sounded slurred. His expression looked uneven. It wasn't something he could hide. And it wasn't something people ignored. As a child, Stallone was constantly reminded that he didn't fit in. Teachers assumed he was slow. Classmates mocked the way he talked. Some laughed openly. Others avoided him altogether. Words cut deep. But silence hurt even more. At home, stability was never guaranteed. His parents' relationship was turbulent, loud, and unpredictable. Arguments filled the house. So did tension. There was little warmth, and even less reassurance. Young Sylvester learned early that the world did not offer safety by default. You had to fight for space. Fight to be heard. Fight to matter. School wasn't an escape. It was another battlefield. He was expelled from more than a dozen schools. Labeled as a troublemaker. A problem. Someone difficult to manage. But behind the anger was something else, confusion. And fear. Fear of being dismissed. Fear of being invisible. Fear that the voices around him might be right. There were moments when he stood alone in empty hallways, listening to distant laughter from classrooms he wasn't welcome in. Moments when he felt like an outsider in every room he entered. That isolation shaped him. He discovered weightlifting as a teenager, not to become strong, but to feel protected. Each repetition became a form of armor. Each drop of sweat, a way to silence doubt. His body began to change. But the insecurity never fully left. Inside, he still carried the same question, am I enough? Movies became his refuge. On screen, he saw characters who were underestimated, and then rose. Men who were knocked down, and stood back up. Those stories spoke to him, not because they were glamorous, but because they felt personal. He didn't dream of fame yet. He dreamed of respect. Of proving that he wasn't broken. What most people didn't see was how deeply these early wounds embedded themselves into his identity. The constant rejection. The feeling of being flawed at birth. The belief that love and acceptance had to be earned through struggle. These experiences didn't disappear when he grew older. They followed him into adulthood. Into every audition room. Into every rejection letter. And later, they would become the emotional backbone of a character named Rocky Balboa. A man underestimated. Dismissed. Mocked. A man who keeps getting up, not because he believes he will win, but because he refuses to stay down. But before that story could ever be written, Stallone still had to face a world that would reject him again and again. And the hardest part was still ahead. When Sylvester Stallone stepped into Hollywood, he didn't arrive with confidence. He arrived with desperation. Audition after audition ended the same way. A polite smile. A short pause. Then rejection. Sometimes the words were gentle. Sometimes they weren't. You don't look like a leading man. Your voice is distracting. You're not what we're looking for. He heard those sentences so many times that they began to sound like facts. Stallone took whatever work he could find. Small roles. Background parts. Characters with no names and no futures. In one film, he appeared for just seconds. In another, he barely spoke at all. It wasn't acting. It was survival. Money disappeared faster than opportunity. Rent became a monthly threat. Food became a calculation. There were days when he walked the streets of New York with nowhere to go, rehearsing lines no one had asked him to read. Days when he questioned whether believing in himself had been a mistake. To stay afloat, he accepted work he would later regret. Films that paid little. Roles that stripped away dignity. But each humiliation carried the same message: this cannot be the end. Rejection followed him relentlessly. Hundreds of auditions turned into thousands of no's. Casting directors stopped calling back. Agents stopped answering. Eventually, there was no safety net left. That was when Stallone became homeless. Nights were spent at the Port Authority bus terminal. Not because it was safe, but because it was warm. Because security tolerated sleepers who didn't cause trouble. He blended into the crowd of people passing through. Invisible. Unnoticed. Hunger sharpened his thoughts. Fear sharpened his resolve. During this time, Stallone watched a boxing match between Muhammad Ali and Chuck Wepner. Wepner wasn't supposed to last. He wasn't supposed to compete. Yet he kept standing. Something clicked. Not an idea. A recognition. Stallone saw himself in that fighter, underestimated, dismissed, absorbing blow after blow, refusing to fall quietly. That night, he went home and began to write. He wrote with urgency. With anger. With every rejection poured into each page. In just 3 days, the script for Rocky was finished. It wasn't polished. It wasn't safe. But it was honest. The story wasn't about winning. It was about endurance. About dignity. About standing your ground when the world expects you to quit. When Stallone began showing the script to producers, something unexpected happened. They liked it. Offers came quickly. But there was a condition. They wanted the script, without him. They offered money. More money than he had ever seen. Enough to solve his problems overnight. But Stallone refused. He had written Rocky for one reason, because it was his story. If he gave that away, he would be right back where he started, invisible again. Weeks passed. Pressure increased. Hunger returned. Still, he said no. Finally, a deal was made. Low budget. High risk. And Stallone would play the lead. The gamble terrified everyone involved. But for Stallone, it was simple. This wasn't about fame. It wasn't about money. It was about existence. If this failed, he would disappear. But if it worked, it would change everything. What no one could predict was how far that change would go, or how high Stallone would rise before falling once again. Because the moment the world finally said yes, a new kind of battle was just beginning. When Rocky premiered, nothing prepared Sylvester Stallone for what came next. The film didn't just succeed. It exploded. Audiences connected instantly. Critics paid attention. And Hollywood, the same industry that had ignored him for years, suddenly couldn't stop saying his name. Rocky went on to win 3 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. The story of an underdog boxer became a cultural moment. And Stallone, once homeless, was now standing under bright lights, surrounded by applause that felt endless. Overnight, he became a symbol. Not just of success, but of perseverance. The embodiment of the American dream. Studios lined up. Contracts grew larger. His face appeared everywhere. Soon came Rocky II, then Rocky III. Then Rambo. The characters blurred together in the public eye. Strong. Unbreakable. Silent but powerful. Stallone's body became a statement. His muscles became armor. His image told the world he was untouchable. But behind the image, something was shifting. Success brought speed. Schedules tightened. Expectations skyrocketed. Every project had to be bigger. Every role had to be stronger. Every appearance had to reinforce the myth. Stallone worked relentlessly. Not because he loved the spotlight, but because he feared losing it. Hollywood rewarded the persona. The unstoppable action hero. The man who never backed down. And slowly, Stallone began to believe it too. He stopped questioning decisions. Stopped listening to doubt. The same insecurity that once pushed him forward now hid beneath confidence. Critics praised him. Fans worshipped him. Money erased the hunger he once knew. But it didn't erase the fear. Because deep inside, he still remembered the bus terminal. He still remembered rejection. He still remembered being dismissed. So he kept running. More films. More control. More pressure. In the 1980s, Stallone reached a level few actors ever touch. He wasn't just famous, he was iconic. Yet icons are expected to be flawless. Mistakes were no longer allowed. Failure was unthinkable. And that expectation came at a cost. The roles began to repeat themselves. The characters grew louder, stronger, less human. The stories leaned more toward spectacle than truth. Stallone started choosing projects to protect the image, not the craft. The applause continued, but something essential was missing. Inside, the satisfaction faded. The victories felt shorter. The emptiness lasted longer. He had everything he once dreamed of. Fame, money, recognition. But fulfillment remained just out of reach. The world saw a man at the top. What they didn't see was the quiet tension building beneath the surface. Because the same drive that pulled Stallone out of poverty was now pushing him toward a different kind of edge. An edge where ego replaced curiosity. Where image replaced honesty. Where fear of falling became stronger than love for the climb. The warning signs were there. Critics became harsher. Audiences began to lose interest. And Stallone, instead of slowing down, pushed harder. By the early 1990s, the tide began to turn. Films underperformed. Reviews grew brutal. The same industry that once celebrated him started to distance itself. Hollywood doesn't forgive repetition. And it never waits. The applause faded faster than Stallone expected. What followed wasn't a dramatic collapse, but a slow, painful realization. That the image he built was no longer protecting him. That strength alone was no longer enough. And for the first time since Rocky, Stallone was forced to confront a terrifying question. Who was he without the cheers? Because the higher you rise, the harder the silence hits when the crowd moves on. And this time, the fall would cut deeper than rejection ever had. The fall didn't come with a single failure. It came quietly. One decision at a time. By the early 1990s, Sylvester Stallone was no longer chasing opportunity. He was chasing relevance. Hollywood had changed. Audiences wanted something new. But Stallone was still holding on to the image that once made him untouchable. He believed strength meant control. And control meant never admitting doubt. So he doubled down. Bigger budgets. Louder action. More spectacle. But the results were different now. Films that were supposed to dominate the box office began to collapse. Critics were unforgiving. Reviews weren't just negative, they were dismissive. The same voice that once praised his determination now mocked his choices. They called his work repetitive, outdated, empty. Stallone read everything. He always had. And every word cut deeper than he let on. Because behind the muscle and confidence was the same boy who had been laughed at in classrooms. The same young man told he didn't belong. Only now, the rejection was public. Hollywood moved fast. Meetings stopped. Scripts stopped coming. The silence was loud. Instead of stepping back, Stallone pushed harder. He believed if he worked more, tried harder, proved himself again, the respect would return. But effort alone couldn't save what was broken. Inside, the pressure began to twist into something darker. He questioned his worth, not as an actor, but as a man. Without the spotlight, who was he? The image he had built for decades started to feel like a prison. Strong men weren't supposed to struggle. Heroes weren't allowed to fall apart. So he didn't talk about it. He carried it alone. Success had once protected him from pain. Now, it magnified it. There were moments when he sat in empty rooms, replaying past triumphs like they belonged to someone else. Moments when he wondered if Rocky had been a one-time miracle, and everything after was just borrowed time. The fear returned. Not the fear of poverty, but the fear of being forgotten. And that fear fueled bad decisions. He accepted projects that didn't challenge him. Roles that tried to recapture old glory instead of creating something new. Each one pushed him further away from the storyteller he once was. The industry didn't wait for him to catch up. Younger stars rose. New faces replaced old icons. Stallone watched from the outside as the world moved on. For the first time since writing Rocky, he felt truly lost. Not hungry. Not broke. But disconnected. Disconnected from purpose. Disconnected from meaning. The applause that once defined him was gone. And without it, the silence forced him to confront a painful truth. He had confused success with identity. And when success disappeared, so did his sense of self. This wasn't a dramatic collapse visible to the public. It was quieter than that. A slow erosion of confidence. A growing distance between who he was and who he pretended to be. And deep down, Stallone knew something had to change. Because if he kept holding on to the past, the fall wouldn't stop here. It would finish him. As the years passed, the damage became harder to ignore. Sylvester Stallone wasn't just facing professional failure. He was facing an internal collapse. The discipline that once saved him now turned into obsession. Control became rigidity. Confidence hardened into ego. He stopped listening. Not just to critics, but to people who cared about him. Every setback felt personal. Every failure felt like proof that the world was finally right about him. That he had never belonged. Physically, the toll was visible. Years of pushing his body beyond limits led to injuries. Surgeries followed. Pain became constant. But Stallone treated pain the same way he always had, by ignoring it. Admitting weakness still felt dangerous. Emotionally, isolation deepened. Success had once surrounded him with people. Failure quietly removed them. Phone calls slowed. Invitations disappeared. Conversations became shorter. Hollywood didn't attack him. It simply moved on. And that indifference hurt more than rejection ever had. There were nights when Stallone questioned everything. His talent. His instincts. His legacy. Was Rocky the only thing he would ever be remembered for? And worse, would it eventually be forgotten too? The irony was brutal. The man who inspired millions to keep fighting now struggled to find a reason to fight himself. He had money. He had a name. But neither could give him peace. The mask of the invincible action hero grew heavier with every year. And the fear beneath it grew louder. Fear of irrelevance. Fear of being exposed. Fear of realizing that his greatest achievement was behind him. He tried to outrun that fear by working more. By holding on to the past. By proving he was still the same man. But the world no longer wanted the same story. And Stallone didn't yet know how to tell a new one. The breaking point didn't come with headlines or scandals. It came in silence. A moment of stillness where he finally understood something he had avoided for decades. That strength wasn't about refusing to fall. It was about knowing when to stop pretending. He had spent his entire life fighting to be seen as strong. But strength, he realized, had become his hiding place. And as long as he hid behind it, he would never move forward. This wasn't the end of his career. But it was the end of an illusion. The illusion that toughness alone could carry him forever. The illusion that the world owed him relevance. The illusion that success could replace purpose. For the first time, Sylvester Stallone didn't know what the next step was. And that uncertainty terrified him. But it also did something else. It cracked the armor. And through that crack, something unfamiliar began to appear. Humility. Because sometimes, the moment you stop fighting the fall, is the moment you finally learn how to stand again. The change didn't begin with a comeback role. It began with an internal surrender. For the first time in decades, Sylvester Stallone stopped trying to prove something. Stopped chasing relevance. Stopped fighting the idea that he had already peaked. And that pause, uncomfortable and unfamiliar, forced him to listen. He began to see the pattern that had shaped his entire life. Every rejection had pushed him to fight harder. Every success had convinced him he needed to fight forever. But now, fighting was no longer saving him. It was exhausting him. Stallone realized that the same armor that once protected him was now suffocating him. The toughness. The control. The refusal to appear vulnerable. So he did something radical. He softened. He stopped asking how to be bigger, stronger, louder, and started asking a different question. What do I actually want to say? That shift changed everything. Instead of trying to recreate old glory, Stallone returned to the one place that had always been honest, storytelling rooted in pain. Not spectacle. Not image. Truth. He looked back at the character that had defined him and realized something surprising. Rocky was never about winning. Rocky was about endurance. About humility. About heart. Somewhere along the way, Stallone had forgotten that. Now, he remembered. He allowed himself to age. Allowed his characters to feel tired. Allowed emotion to replace invincibility. The work became quieter. More reflective. More human. And audiences felt the difference. This wasn't a loud comeback. There were no headlines announcing a triumphant return. Instead, there was a gradual rebuilding, not of fame, but of meaning. Stallone reconnected with the reasons he started in the first place. To express what it feels like to be underestimated. To give voice to people who keep standing even when no one is watching. He also redefined success. No longer measured by box office numbers. No longer dependent on applause. Success became waking up without fear. Creating without needing validation. Letting go of the version of himself that needed to dominate every room. There was humility in that release. And freedom. Stallone began speaking openly about failure. About insecurity. About the cost of pretending to be invulnerable. For someone once defined by strength, this honesty became his greatest strength. The world responded not with shock, but with respect. Because resilience doesn't always look like punching forward. Sometimes it looks like stepping back and choosing a different path. This rebirth wasn't about reclaiming the spotlight. It was about reclaiming himself. And for the first time, Stallone felt aligned. Not with expectations. But with purpose. He no longer needed to outrun his past. He had learned how to carry it. The boy who was mocked for his voice. The man who slept in a bus terminal. The star who lost his way. They were all part of the same story. And instead of rejecting those chapters, Stallone embraced them. Because every fall had taught him something essential. That endurance without self-awareness leads to collapse. But endurance paired with humility leads to transformation. He hadn't erased his failures. He had integrated them. And that integration, quiet, grounded, honest, marked the true turning point. Not the return of a hero, but the evolution of a human being. As Sylvester Stallone moved into the later chapters of his life, something fundamental had changed. He no longer chased the spotlight. He allowed it to come and go. There was a calmness in that shift. A quiet confidence that didn't need to prove itself. Stallone continued working, but with intention. He chose roles that reflected experience, loss, and growth. Characters who had lived, failed, and learned. He no longer needed to be the strongest man in the room. He was more interested in being the most honest. Off-screen, his perspective softened as well. He spoke openly about regret. About mistakes. About the emotional cost of success when it's built on fear. The man once known for fists and firepower began talking about vulnerability and self-awareness. And people listened. Because it felt real. Rocky, the character that once saved his life, evolved alongside him. No longer a symbol of invincibility, but of resilience across time. Of aging with dignity. Of accepting limits without surrendering spirit. For millions around the world, Rocky was never just a boxer. He was proof that being underestimated doesn't mean being defeated. That you don't have to win to matter. You just have to keep showing up. That message outlived trends. Outlived decades. Outlived Stallone's own rise and fall. And that is where his true legacy lives. Not in box office numbers. Not in awards. But in people who saw themselves in his struggle. In those who were told they weren't good enough. Smart enough. Strong enough. In those who felt forgotten. Dismissed. Behind. Stallone didn't just portray that pain. He lived it. And by sharing it honestly, he gave others permission to keep going. His later years were not about rewriting history. They were about understanding it. Understanding that success doesn't erase insecurity. That strength without reflection becomes isolation. And that growth often comes from letting go, not holding on tighter. The industry that once rejected him now viewed him differently. Not as an action icon. But as a survivor. Someone who had endured the full cycle, obscurity, fame, collapse, and renewal. And that cycle gave his voice weight. Because it wasn't theoretical. It was earned. Today, when people look at Sylvester Stallone, they don't just see muscles or movie posters. They see a life that refused to stay defined by its lowest moment. Or its highest one. They see a man who learned that identity cannot be built on applause. Only on purpose. That understanding became his final contribution. A reminder that resilience is not about never breaking. It's about learning how to rebuild without losing yourself. And that sometimes, the most powerful legacy you can leave behind, is proof that it's never too late to become whole. Sylvester Stallone's life was never a straight climb upward. It was a circle. From a child mocked for his voice, to a man sleeping in a bus terminal with $106, to a global icon, and then back to silence, doubt, and reinvention. Twice in one lifetime, he hit the bottom. Not because he wasn't strong enough, but because strength alone was never the answer. His story reminds us of something uncomfortable, yet essential. Success does not heal old wounds. Applause does not replace purpose. And toughness without self-awareness eventually breaks. What saved Stallone wasn't fame. It wasn't muscles. It wasn't money. It was the willingness to keep going, and later, the courage to change. To let go of who he thought he had to be, and become who he truly was. You don't need to be perfect to move forward. You don't need the world's permission to begin again. Sometimes, simply refusing to stay down is enough. Because resilience isn't about winning every fight. It's about standing back up, with humility, honesty, and heart. And maybe the most powerful question isn't what Stallone achieved, but this: so what's your story?